October 21st, 2011. Interstate 94 near Chelsea, Michigan, roughly 60 miles west of Detroit. An ordinary Michigan State Police traffic stop is about to expose one of the strangest drug smuggling stories in American history. An elderly man is driving east in a Lincoln pickup, looking less like a criminal than someone's grandfather heading home from the garden center. He's 87 years old, wearing hearing aids, with the weathered appearance of a man who has spent decades working outdoors. But when a drug detection dog circles the truck and suddenly sits down, everything changes. Investigators search the covered truck bed and discover duffel bags containing 104 kilograms of cocaine, worth nearly $3 million on the street. The driver is Leo Earl Sharp, a decorated World War II veteran and one of America's most respected daylily breeders. At that moment, on the shoulder of a Michigan highway, one of the most bizarre chapters in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel comes to an end. To gardeners, Leo Sharp was a legend. To the cartel, he was El Tata, meaning the grandfather. He had spent years quietly transporting enormous quantities of cocaine across America while looking like the least suspicious courier imaginable. If you've seen Clint Eastwood's 2018 movie The Mule, you already know the basic story. Eastwood played Earl Stone, an aging gardener recruited to transport drugs for a cartel. But Hollywood changed almost everything surrounding the central idea. The real story of Leo Sharp is stranger, darker, and in some ways even more unbelievable. Leo Earl Sharp was born on May 7, 1924, in Michigan City, Indiana, during a period when America was still recovering from the Great Depression. His childhood was difficult, and like many young Americans of his generation, his life was transformed by World War II. Sharp eventually served in the United States Army during the Italian campaign, fighting through some of the most brutal battles of the war. He returned home with a Bronze Star, although he rarely spoke publicly about what he had experienced. After the war, Sharp built what appeared to be an ordinary American life. But he eventually discovered something that would become his life's passion: flowers. More specifically, daylilies. Sharp wasn't simply a gardener. He became a highly respected breeder who spent decades creating new varieties of daylilies. The process required patience and obsession. He would take pollen from one flower, transfer it to another, collect the resulting seeds, plant them, and wait years to see what developed. Most combinations failed, but occasionally a completely new and beautiful flower appeared. Sharp established Brookwood Gardens in Michigan City and gradually built an international reputation. His plants were collected by gardeners across the country and around the world. He introduced numerous varieties, earned recognition within the daylily community, traveled to garden societies, and reportedly sold some of his newest plants for more than $100 each. By the time he reached old age, Leo Sharp had already accomplished something most people spend their entire lives trying to achieve. He had built a reputation, created something lasting, and become a respected figure in his field. But his greatest success would eventually become the source of his greatest financial problem. By the 2000s, the world around Sharp had changed dramatically. The mail-order flower business was moving online, but Sharp was resistant to the new system. He was a traditionalist who preferred catalogs, phone calls, personal relationships, and handshakes. While the world was embracing websites and online ordering, Sharp continued doing business the old-fashioned way. The result was devastating. Orders declined, expenses remained, and the farm that had supported him for decades began to collapse financially. The man who had survived the Depression and a world war was now facing an entirely different enemy: debt. Sharp was in his 80s, his business was failing, and the life's work he had spent decades building was slipping away. That financial desperation became the opening the cartel needed. Workers on Sharp's property included Mexican laborers, and through those connections he was reportedly introduced to people associated with the Sinaloa Cartel, the powerful trafficking organization connected to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The offer was remarkably simple: drive a vehicle from the southwest to Michigan, deliver a load, and get paid. Sharp accepted. And with that decision, an elderly flower breeder entered a completely different world. He became a courier for one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the Western Hemisphere. The brilliance of the arrangement was that almost nobody would suspect him. Drug interdiction operations naturally focus on patterns. Officers look for suspicious behavior, unusual vehicles, nervous drivers, known trafficking routes, and people who fit established profiles. Leo Sharp fit almost none of them. He was an elderly white man, a World War II veteran, a respected gardener, and someone who looked more likely to complain about his roses than transport cocaine. The cartel understood that perfectly. Sharp would travel thousands of miles between the Southwest and Michigan, often carrying enormous loads. He reportedly picked up cocaine in Arizona and drove roughly 2,000 miles northeast toward the Detroit area. He stayed in motels, paid cash, followed the speed limit, and avoided drawing attention. His job was simple: get the drugs from one place to another. Once he reached Michigan, other members of the organization handled the distribution. The operation was based on routine, discipline, and trust. Sharp reportedly earned around $1,000 per kilogram delivered. That meant a single 100-kilogram shipment could potentially earn him around $100,000. And as the cartel became more confident in him, the loads became larger. Prosecutors later said Sharp transported quantities ranging from around 100 kilograms to as much as 300 kilograms on individual trips. Court records documented significant runs during 2010 and 2011, while people connected to the operation suggested his involvement may have started years earlier. By the time investigators understood the scale of his activity, the government believed he had transported more than a ton of cocaine and earned more than $1 million. What made Leo Sharp so valuable wasn't just his age, it was his reliability. Inside the cartel's Detroit operation, he became known as Tata, the grandfather. Wiretapped conversations later revealed that members of the organization spoke about him with an unusual level of affection. Sharp wasn't treated simply as another disposable driver. He had become someone they trusted. But he was also stubborn. He reportedly disliked being controlled and often refused to follow the schedule his handlers wanted. He didn't like being constantly contacted, and attempts to keep track of him on the road could be frustrating. Sharp would drive according to his own schedule, stop when he wanted, and arrive when he arrived. Yet the cartel tolerated his behavior because there was one thing that mattered more than obedience: he delivered. The image is almost absurd. Somewhere on America's interstate system, an 80-something grandfather-looking man could be eating at a roadside diner while hundreds of kilograms of cocaine sat nearby in his truck. The organization responsible for some of the most violent drug trafficking in the world had placed enormous trust in a man who looked completely harmless. And Sharp appeared to use much of the money to preserve the life that had been collapsing around him. Reports indicate that he invested money back into his property, his farming operation, flowers, and other real estate, including property in Hawaii where he could garden year-round. He wasn't behaving like someone suddenly obsessed with luxury. He appeared to be trying to keep his old life alive. While Leo Sharp was quietly making these long-distance runs, the deer was closing in on the cartel operation in Detroit. Federal investigators had been building a case against the local Sinaloa distribution network, and one of the agents involved was Jeff Moore. The investigation relied heavily on wiretaps and surveillance. Wiretapping a major drug organization isn't as simple as turning on a recording device. Agents have to convince a judge that traditional investigative methods have failed, and each authorization is limited, meaning investigators must continue producing evidence to justify extensions. Call by call, the DEA began mapping the organization, suppliers, stash houses, distributors, couriers, and the people coordinating shipments. Then they began hearing something that didn't make sense. Conversations repeatedly referred to an old courier called Tata. An elderly driver carrying enormous drug shipments sounded so improbable that some investigators initially wondered whether the name was simply a code word, but the recordings indicated otherwise. Tata was real, and he was bringing the next load. The DEA now had a problem. If federal agents simply arrested Sharp themselves, the cartel would immediately realize that their communications had been compromised. The larger investigation could collapse. So investigators needed the arrest to look like an ordinary traffic stop. The solution was to let a Michigan State Police trooper make what appeared to be a routine stop on Interstate 94. The cartel would hopefully interpret the seizure as bad luck rather than evidence that investigators had been listening to them for months. That plan led directly to October 21, 2011. Leo Sharp was driving east on I-94 near Chelsea, Michigan. He was 87 years old and had 104 kilograms of cocaine hidden in his pickup. Then the police lights appeared. Sharp pulled over. A trooper approached the vehicle and began what appeared to be a normal traffic stop. But the drug detection dog soon changed everything. The dog alerted to the truck, investigators searched it, and the duffel bags were discovered. Inside was approximately 229 pounds of cocaine. After years of operating almost invisibly, El Tata finally had a face, a name, and an arrest record. The man who had crossed thousands of miles of American highways carrying millions of dollars in drugs was now standing on the side of a Michigan interstate as a criminal defendant. The seizure became part of a much larger federal case targeting the Sinaloa Cartel's Detroit operation, which eventually involved more than a dozen defendants. Sharp's age became one of the most unusual elements of the prosecution. By the time his case reached its final stages, he was approaching 90. His defense emphasized his age, deteriorating health, and declining mental condition. In October 2013, at 89 years old, Sharp pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute cocaine. He also surrendered hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and assets connected to the operation. On May 7, 2014, his 90th birthday, prosecutors argued that the enormous quantity of cocaine involved justified a 5-year prison sentence regardless of his age. His defense asked for home confinement and argued that Sharp suffered from dementia and had been pressured by the cartel to continue making deliveries even after he wanted to stop. The details surrounding that claim remained complicated. What is clear is that Sharp expressed deep regret in court. During sentencing, he told Judge Nancy Edmonds that he was heartbroken about what he had done. The judge had to weigh two very different versions of the same man. The decorated veteran and respected horticulturist on one side, and a courier responsible for moving more than a ton of cocaine on the other. Ultimately, Sharp was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He turned 90 that very day. Sharp did not remain in prison for long. His health deteriorated significantly, and after roughly a year behind bars, he was released early in 2015. He returned to Michigan, where he spent his final period of life surrounded by the world he had known before the cartel. On December 12, 2016, Leo Sharp died at the age of 92. His life had contained 3 completely different chapters: war hero, flower breeder, and cartel courier. But the story didn't end with his death. Hollywood had already begun transforming his bizarre life into something much larger. In 2014, the New York Times published an extensive story by journalist Sam Dolnick about the 90-year-old drug mule. The article attracted attention in Hollywood, including from Clint Eastwood. Eastwood eventually turned the story into The Mule, starring himself as Earl Stone alongside Bradley Cooper, Diane Wiest, Michael P., Lawrence Fishburne, and Andy Garker. The film was released in December 2018, 2 years after Sharp's death. It reportedly cost around $50 million to make and earned roughly $170 million worldwide. The movie captured the basic concept, but the real story was far different from the Hollywood version. Earl Stone was created as a fictional character, and many of the movie's most emotional elements never happened to Leo Sharp. The broken relationship with Earl's daughter, the family drama, the granddaughter's wedding, the reconciliation with his wife, and the emotional journey that drives the film were largely created for the screenplay. The cartel's extravagant parties, violent confrontations, and many of the interactions between Earl and his handlers were also dramatized. What remained true was the central spine of the story: an elderly veteran and celebrated gardener whose business collapsed, a man who was recruited to transport cocaine for a Mexican cartel, an unusually trusted courier who became known as the Grandfather, a deer investigation that eventually uncovered him, and an arrest that came when he was nearly 90 years old. If anything, Hollywood actually made the scale of his criminal career smaller. Earl Stone feels like a man who makes a handful of deliveries. The real Leo Sharp was believed to have transported cocaine repeatedly over years, with individual loads sometimes weighing hundreds of kilograms. The movie gives audiences a strange story. The real case was even stranger. The cartel itself continued after Sharp was gone. The Detroit operation was dismantled through the investigation that eventually captured him, but the larger Sinaloa organization survived. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was captured in Mexico in 2014, escaped prison in 2015, was recaptured in 2016, and was eventually extradited to the United States. In 2019, a federal jury in Brooklyn convicted him on multiple charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison plus additional years. The machine continued moving, replacing people as it always had. Leo Sharp was replaced too. That is the cold reality of organized crime. Even people who become trusted are ultimately expendable. And while his criminal story became famous, another part of his legacy quietly survived. The daylilies Leo Sharp bred continued to exist. Gardeners continued buying, growing, trading, and enjoying varieties connected to his work. His real life's work outlived the crime that made him famous, and that may be the strangest part of the entire Leo Sharp story. He wasn't a career criminal who suddenly discovered a new way to make money. He was an old man whose life's work had collapsed, who found himself drowning financially, and who accepted an opportunity that eventually transformed him into one of the most unlikely drug couriers in American history. His story exposes the weakness of criminal profiling. The cartel understood something that law enforcement profiles could not. People tend to look for criminals where they expect criminals to be. Nobody expects a white-haired 80-year-old war veteran to be transporting hundreds of kilograms of cocaine. That assumption made Sharp valuable. But the story also reveals something more uncomfortable: desperation can be a powerful recruiter. Sharp had spent decades building a life around flowers, reputation, and independence. When that world began disappearing, the cartel offered him a way to keep it alive. The money gave him another season, another property, another chance to continue doing what he loved. But the price was enormous. Leo Sharp spent decades creating beautiful living things and only a few years moving some of the most destructive cargo in America. Both versions of his life were real. Both belonged to the same man. And that is what makes the true story behind the Mule so compelling. Leo Sharp wasn't simply a good man who suddenly became evil, nor was he secretly a lifelong criminal hiding behind flowers. He was a complicated human being who reached a point where desperation, opportunity, pride, and circumstance pushed him across a line he could never completely erase. In the end, the most unbelievable part isn't that an elderly man transported a ton of cocaine. It's that he spent most of his life becoming someone nobody would ever suspect. The war hero, the famous gardener, and El Tata were all the same person. And long after the movie ended, the flowers he created were still blooming. If you want more deep dives into the hidden world of the American Mafia, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.